Now we'd like to warmly welcome our final and keynote speech for the morning, which is turning into the afternoon. Welcome the Honourable Kevin Rudd, twice Prime Minister of Australia in 2007, 2013, who brings all kinds of wonderful experience to the table here. Please welcome.
Thank you. Could someone just give me that little light there? Well, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's no longer morning. Good morning, World Bank land, Waterland, those of you who occupy both those domains. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I now stand between you and your non-beef intensive, positively vegan, comprehensively tedious lunch. Is that right? So we can just keep on going for a while because I'm not standing between you and anything that's remotely tasty. I wear a few hats these days. I'm president of something called the Asia Policy Institute in New York. It's part of the Asia Society. It's been around for about 60 years. I'm a China guy by training before I lurched down the food chain of life into politics. I'm also, in the last couple of years, been chair of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, which has been looking at the long-term reform of the UN. Not you guys, not the Bretton Woods institution, just the UN. There you go. You want to know about the UN, your friends, foes, enemies, ambassador within the UN system. It's all there for you to read, forget and ignore. But that was the product of the last couple of years of work. And then a year or so ago, Tony Lake from UNICEF decided to ring me up and ask if I wanted to become chair of the Global Partnership of Sanitation and Water for All. And so my question back to Tony was, how many people have turned this down already? And he just smiled. He was too polite to tell me. But that's why I am where I am. Now, you good folks in the room know seriously what you're talking about. You're either water policy people, you're either people who understand water-related technologies, or you're development finance experts. Any of you don't fit into any of those three categories around the room? Put your hands up. Okay, so you're all here legitimately. I mean, that's pretty impressive. First international conference I've been to along those lines. But I'm none of those things. I'm not a water policy expert. I certainly have never worked in the technologies associated with supply and demand side management, and I certainly have not worked in the area of development finance. And so when I spoke to Jim Kim about this morning, I said, so what the hell do you want me to talk about? And he said, I want you to talk about the political economy and the politics of doing significant water reform. And so I'll try to bring some of those perspectives to bear in my remarks to you this morning. So my credentials are that, first of all, I'm from Australia. That's part of the map of Australia that you can see there. Australia, how many of you have been to Australia? Okay, the Australian Tourism Commission has an office just outside there. There's a lot of you who haven't. You go out the door, it's about 20,000 miles that way. It's a very dry place. You would have seen from the map before, it's the driest continent on Earth. We've been wrestling with water scarcity for all of our settled history. And the Indigenous people of Australia, our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, have wrestled with it for millennia. The second is, I actually grew up on a farm. I'll try and find where the farm was. It's dead. If you go to the northern end of that map there, you'll see a city called Brisbane. You go to north of that about another 100 miles or so. That's kind of where I grew up. What I remember about farm life is pretty simple. One, we had no sewerage. So for those of us who work in the wash space, sanitation space, I know exactly what the dilemmas are. And it can be challenging. When I make these remarks around the countries of Africa and Asia about my own childhood experiences, it creates an automatic kinship with what it's like not having wonderful first world sanitation services. But that's been my experience. But what I also remember as a kid growing up is that we were afflicted by droughts and fires and all the things that you associated with romantic novels about Australia. But when it really did drought, we had a natural well on our farm. And my father would become, as it were, the distributor informally of water entitlements to the surrounding community for domestic use. He didn't charge. It was seen as a public good. No one conceptualised these things in those days. That's simply what happened. But it did occur to me that he was sitting on top of this extraordinary resource. I also come from the state of Queensland, which is the northern of the three states. No, go back to the map, please. Northern of the three states atop that river system. And the reason I mention that is the Murray-Darling river system, which that map describes, is about 3,500 kilometres long from the top to where it empties out into the Southern Ocean to the southwest of the map that's on the screen in front of you. And the reason I say that is that where we grew up, we were up the top. We were where, in fact, the streams flowed into the rivers, which then fed into the Darling, which fed into the Murray. And coming from the great state of Queensland, as I did, we couldn't give a damn about anyone to the south of us. But we did. We built dams. And as a consequence, the growing up in the local rural politics of, well, this is our river system and who gives a fig about anyone to the south of us, is, I think, an experience that has been had by many communities around river systems and catchment areas around the world. Rolling the clock along a little further, I found myself, after a period as being an Australian diplomat working in China, back in Australia, back in my home state of Queensland, and as Cabinet Secretary for the state government, then negotiating the first intergovernmental agreement on water resource policy and developing the first national water resource policy for the country. Because by that stage, 1994, we realised that we had a serious emerging scarcity problem across the system, which meant that, and as the documents for the first time said in the history of the Federation of Australia, that unless we had minimum environmental flows for the system, it would just die and be incapable of delivering any other water for the other competing uses of the system, be they rural, urban, agricultural, or for sanitation and drinking purposes. Roll the clock again another 10 or 15 years after that, I find myself as Prime Minister of the whole country, not just my home state of Queensland. Suddenly we have a different perspective to bring to bear. You've got to manage the whole bloody thing. And as a consequence of that, we by this stage, 2007, 2008, in another period of drought in Australia, recognised that the entire system, as a consequence of climate change, was suffering over time a 20% reduction in the overall flows into the system. And as a consequence, we had to reach some radical and hard and quick decisions about how we're going to manage the overall competing uses of the system. So I was responsible for brokering the politics of what became then the Intergovernmental Agreement on Water in Australia, which created one, for the first time in our history, a Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Two, one which was responsible, therefore, for the environmental allocations, the agricultural allocations, and the urban allocations across the river system. And three, for the pricing system across. And four, an evolving national plan done annually for the system, contingent on the big variable, which is what are the climatic conditions of that particular year. This was not easy. We had fights, we had protests, we had the public burnings of documents, not of people. But we managed after 3 years to get our way through. That's the perspective I just want to seek to bring to you this morning as I make now what I describe as a quick list of about 10 core experiences, to the extent that these are useful to your work here. Learning number one for us is to obtain a general nationwide recognition of scarcity. This is harder to do than it is to say, depending on where you are in the system. We'd been attempting forms of collaboration across that great river system for 100 years before I sat down and presided over, through a meeting of the federal government and all the relevant state governments, the establishment of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. But it was predicated on a collective agreement across the federal government and the state governments and local communities, that we objectively, scientifically had a water scarcity problem. Achieving that conceptual consensus is, frankly, ground station one before you can do anything else. It is the local application of the water scarcity reality so eloquently and elegantly described by many of the previous speakers in their lightning presentations. Number two, it is impossible to bring about immediate catchment-wide or national reform unless you have begun over a period of time to develop the institutional machinery for collaboration across the catchment. It's difficult to go from no machinery to total machinery. As I said before, we had 100 years of experience of beginning with thin levels of catchment-wide collaboration to very thick levels of catchment-wide collaboration, culminating in the legislation we were able to introduce after I was elected to office in 2007. What we've seen, therefore, is an evolution of these institutional arrangements, and therefore the culture which emerges from that among policymakers, amongst technical experts, but also amongst water ministers across the Federation, was a culture of evolving collaboration. Learning number two. Learning number three, and this is critical, mutual and collective acceptance of the competing sectoral interests across the entire catchment system. That urban water use is a legitimate interest. That rural water use is a legitimate interest. That the environmental flow, which has no spokesperson, because it's the environment, Mother Earth doesn't have a spokesperson, unless we choose to be it, that environmental flow also was a fundamental, basic interest, and a legitimate one. And until there was acceptance of the collective legitimacy of those competing interests, we were not going to make any progress. And this did not occur until, frankly, the 1990s. Number four, general learning, is to obtain general acceptance of the validity of scientific studies which defined the minimum environmental flow that was necessary for the system to remain healthy and usable for all users. This is problematic. It's problematic for the same reasons that you will have debates still raging in this city, in this country, in this capital, over the science underpinning climate change. So too are there technical debates concerning, for example, minimum environmental flows necessary to ensure the long-term health of the overall river system. But after a period of time and multiple scientific studies, what happens is a scientific consensus emerges about what is necessary for minimum environmental flow. Otherwise, it becomes entirely a subjective political debate and you make no progress at all. In our case, we had to establish what was the minimum environmental flow necessary in a system which had a total annual flow of 13,000 gigalitres. Learning number five, developing through parallel scientific study and community recognition what therefore would have to yield either in terms of urban use or rural use, agricultural use. And given that agricultural use in this river system, consistent with your experiences across so many river systems in the world, it's the overwhelming user of the system was in terms of Australian agriculture. Not as bad as wheat in Saudi Arabia, not as bad as some of the cultivation we just saw in the Arizona desert, but in some parts of Australia, against any rational economic criteria, use of land which was not designed for, suited to intensive cultivation, unless you were going to use free water, and there is no such thing as free water. Learning number six was for urban use, the development of robust pricing mechanisms so that those who were consuming water from the river system, and in fact even those consuming water from other sources in other capital cities of Australia, that this was based on a pricing system robustly tied to the quantity of use. Seven, and most problematically, a learning concerning rural use. For us, within this, we had to establish the concept that there is a clear differentiation between a land entitlement and a water right entitlement. The history of the evolution of the land title system in our country was to assume that one belonged to the other. Separating that out in the mind of farmers was a difficult thing to do until entered the possibility of earning some money from it. Never stand between a farmer and a bucket of money. You'll get run over in the crush. And so by then establishing, in terms of rural use, the capacity to separately identify water title or water entitlements and to make them tradable across the system, tradable so that they could not only trade with one another in terms of temporary sale or permanent sale to one another, other farmers that is, but you then had a capacity for them to earn a huge bucket of money by selling their water rights back to the government, back to the Murray-Darling Authority. And that is what we did. Suddenly, from being the farmer's enemy, you become the farmer's friend once they work out what the bottom line is. I'm sure that's just Australian sort of human behaviour. It's not replicated in any other country in the world. Then, on top of that, what was required was sufficient financial capacity on the part of the national government through state governments to then make the purchases of water title back to the Murray-Darling Authority in order to underpin the necessary level of environmental flow for the system. So, for us, total flow of the system, 13,000 gigalitres per year. We calculated we needed to buy back 3,000 gigalitres a year. That was expensive. That's a multi-billion-dollar exercise. But if you do it over time, you can make progress. Learning number 8, politics. Politics hard, which is if you wish to affect all of the above and bring it together in terms of a finally agreed national plan, it's necessary for you to have a political mandate as the elected national political leader to do so. In the 2007 Australian elections, I went to the elections saying, we will have a single Murray-Darling Basin Authority. It will establish minimum environmental flows. It will bring in pricing for all users of the system. I was elected. I'm not sure many people read the detail of that policy at the time I was elected. They're probably focusing on other things as well. But no one could ever challenge the legitimacy of the mandate in a functioning parliamentary democracy such as our own. 2, then the hard politics of going to rural Australia, agricultural Australia, with a range of options which had the effect of either bringing back about 30% of total water entitlements back to the Murray-Darling Authority, 28% or 22%. It was a classic 3-card trick, which is, no, we don't want 28, no, we don't want 26, and we don't really want 22. So we compromised on 20, which is where we wanted to be in the first place. 20 actually yielded for us 2,800 gigalitres per annum, against the scientific conclusion which said that we needed 3,000. But there's a lot of politics lying between, shall I say, 2,800 and 3,000. Never let the perfect get in the road of the good, particularly when you're dealing with something as murky as politics. As a result of all the above, we also were able to then establish the Murray-Darling Authority with the capacity to set annual basin-wide plans, the precise allocation depending on inflow from natural sources of what urban use quota would be for the year, what rural use quota would be, what the environmental quota would be, and an ability to vary that from year to year based on scientific advice to an independent authority. The result overall was that, as I said before, we agreed to take out just under 3,000 gigalitres per annum for the entire system. And if you've got that second slide that I presented, the one with all the numbers on it, you might see, if you can decipher the text, and I can't even read it from this distance, but it shows that our progress to date is that we've therefore extracted so far about 1,900 of the 2,800 gigalitres that we need to. We're on track to get to our 2,800 by when the whole scheme becomes fully nationally operational in 2019, having signed the intergovernmental agreement in 2009. Which brings me to my other point in the generic learning. It takes time. If you bring it in over time, people are going to, frankly, find gradual change headed in a particular direction much more acceptable than simply being thrown off a cliff into a whole new reality. Learning number 9 is that your national government, and this may be where international financial institutions can come to the assistance of national governments or provincial governments, must have the financial capacity to undertake the buyout of water entitlements. If you simply come to the table and say to a bunch of state governments or subnational governments or local governments, let alone the actual agricultural title holders themselves, you need to be virtuous in your hearts and be wonderful global citizens and genuine believers in the next generation who will take over the planet, and do this of your own voluntary accord, I'm sorry to say that I found that Australian citizens were not so minded. But if you throw a bunch of cash on the table, which is frankly determined based on a rational scientific analysis of what has to be taken out of the system, what the market is beginning to indicate in terms of the tradability of the entitlements, and what they therefore can retire with once they sell their water entitlements and probably their land and go and retire on the beach somewhere with a nice house, well, half a nice house, then suddenly you're talking Turkey and you can make a difference. And the very final learning is this. All the above is just fine and dandy, but you must legislate it. It must become entrenched in national laws, which is what we did through the Australian Water Act. And as a consequence, all the mechanisms, powers and entitlements of the Murray-Darling Authority, its ability to produce annual basin-wide plans and the ability to buy back entitlements is entrenched in law. And a monitoring mechanism of the one that I just described before in terms of what was on that table to measure year by year how many entitlements are coming back and what the overall environmental flow, etc., is of the entire system. My friends, none of that is perfect. It's dealing with the ugliness of politics. But that is where I'd like to conclude my remarks to you today. As many of the earlier presenters said, this is not one of these things arranged on the stage before you in terms of these lovely, elegant cubes. It's all of these things. It is both a physical and political ecosystem. It is block by block by block by block, from big water to medium water to small water to the use in domestic use and onto sanitation and to other purposes. But it's the recognition that each one of these cubes represents an aggregation of interests which actually has to be dealt with and addressed and not ignored or regarded as being somehow inherently illegitimate. And that, I think, was our key learning across all the things that we have sought to do. And for you guys and girls in the World Bank, I've never worked in the World Bank. I've had a lot of dealings with presidents of the World Bank, going back to Wolfenson, through Zellick and on to Jim Kim. I have some idea of what you do in the field. But I think my overall suggestion to you all is that you live, by and large, in a relatively rational environment. You are rational people who seek to make rational decisions and provide rational advice to governments around the world about what they need to do to deal with water scarcity. That is good. But you know what I'm going to say next? The world which I've inhabited for a large part of my career is not perfectly rational. It's called politics. And therefore, where I find most good reforms, whether it's in this space, or in the climate change space, or in the rest, is that they fall down is public servants, domestic or international, saying, unclean, unclean, unclean. I'm not going anywhere near the political process. And a bunch of politicians who are elected or re-elected with far too greater levels of frequency so that institutional memory is lost, saying, I don't understand, I don't understand, I don't understand. There is a need for what I would describe as competent, politically literate bureaucrats, national and international, to frankly undertake the complex brokering which is necessary between on-the-ground and national political realities on the one hand, and what all you good folk in this room, and I think I understand as being sound public policy, to deliver on the challenge of dealing with water scarcity now and into the future. Unless that divide is crossed, then frankly, you will find very little that happens. I'm deeply inspired by the fact that we have another high-level bloody panel on water. For God's sake, a problem in the world, let's have another high-level panel. Sorry for being heretical. They all do good things, I'm sure. But that doesn't achieve one jot of progress in terms of effective catchment management, one of the critical river systems in the world, which if we don't effectively manage it, will make the Indus crisis that we've had in the last period of time simply the early forerunner of a range of similar such crises across conflicted and conflicting river systems and water management systems and catchment systems across the world. So what I'm saying to you, I think, is in this room you have an enormous bucket of expertise. You have a bucket of policy expertise. You have a bucket of development finance expertise. It needs to be turbocharged by those among you who have the inclination and I suppose the taste for a little bit of professional risk to step up and to give it some political turbocharging as well. I'm not talking about political turbocharging in the stratosphere in terms of what happens with the next iteration of the high-level panel's bloody report. That will inevitably be written and reach the conclusions which we've all reached for the last 20 years on these subjects. But the bottom line is, it is, frankly, the political turbocharging which needs to occur between the bank, between your partners in particular countries against particular projects around the challenges associated with effective long-term catchment management which underpin the health of our river systems across the world and therefore our water supply across the world. My final point as I close is this, and your vegan sandwiches are waiting, is that we come from SWA, Sanitation Water for All. Any of you heard of it in the room? Okay. Any of you not heard of it? It's a very impassive audience. So Sanitation Water for All has been around for 10 years, thereabouts. We work very closely with the World Bank. We only look at part of this, okay? We understand that we're one part of the jigsaw, which is where big water becomes medium water, becomes small water, and deals with, frankly, the sanitation challenge in particular around the world. But we do know from one of the earlier lightning presentations that the absence of clean drinking water, the absence of sanitation, is one of the continued tragedies of what we're delivering through the Sustainable Development Goal process. Water, big or small, still remains an orphan within the global system. I hate to say that. You guys are probably its best parents in the absence of any other institutional home, you in the bank. I'd actually seize that with both hands and run with it as hard as you can if I were you. But for those reasons, we in our world, the SWA world, we seek to bring together sector ministers who are responsible for water and sanitation within their various countries, 50 or 60 countries. We have them meet once or twice a year. And for the first time in the spring meetings this year here in Washington, DC, we bring them together with their finance ministers as well. Now, there's a meeting of two different worlds. Finance ministers, when they look at sector ministers, say, you are a problem, because you want a lot of money to be spent on stuff which I know is in big demand in our country, but it's so intergenerational. Where's the political benefit for me and for my president? So what's the political challenge? As I see it, as someone who's been both in the public policy business as an official, like you, but then as a Prime Minister engaged in hand-to-hand combat in national politics as well, is how do we therefore make water and sanitation for all into something which finance ministers can turn into a political success within their own countries? How can you do that? How can you therefore convince the finance minister that you can yield better financial returns from your current investment in your national water and sanitation investments, rather than have a lot of those investments simply underperforming? That you can, if you have good policy settings domestically, encourage your domestic owners of private finance to actually invest in such projects and earn a predictable dollar from it as well, given the scarcity of public finance at home and abroad, and the limitations on the bank's balance sheet, as was indicated in one of the earlier presentations as well. And putting it most crudely, how can we help you, Finance Minister of Country X, one day become President of your country? Because if you really do water and sanitation well in your country, if you do open up your domestic capital markets, if you have a decent plan, and you are working with your new best friend, the Sector Minister, guess what? It'll be politically good news for you as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Rudd, and for inspiring speech and comments and suggestions how we tackle the political economy of our work. I think, like I said, that's very fundamental to our work. In fact, that we're making a decision about its beefness meal for this week. Eat smarter and save water. We know that is not a popular decision to make, but I think one has to make trade-off. In fact, there were audience sitting from Argentina, from Nebraska, who say that this is bad for our rangers, right? So, but that's the trade-off. What we're making a symbolic gesture. So I appeal to everyone, pick up a button, and that's what we're going to practice this week. Second thing, I know lunch is just ready to make adjustments to our programs because we're a bit late for this session. So the next session, we try to start at 2 o'clock or maybe 2:10 to the extent we can. We're trying to abbreviate that. But second thing, more importantly, is about this weather condition that we're expecting today. Now, we still don't see anything. It may not happen, but all the forecasts said that there's going to be a huge storm tonight, which may impact, as you know, for those who live in Washington, this city could be paralyzed for a certain amount of snow. If that happens, it might cause some impact. So we're now making contingency plan. We circulate an email. If that happens, if the facilities are closed or a lot of people are still around, then we'll start the session tomorrow from lunch. We'll start lunch at 12 p.m., and then we'll adjust our program to catch up as we move forward. Later today, we'll still be together. We'll make, as the weather condition or forecast has become more accurate, we'll share with you. Maybe nothing will happen, then we'll continue with our program. But that's the sort of contingency plan we're making. So thanks very much for your attention, and let's have lunch. And just one more announcement.
Okay, just quickly before we go to lunch, I can't believe as a facilitator I'm going to ask this, but can everyone please take out your smartphones? We have a Poll Everywhere app that we're going to be using throughout the meeting this week to get input from the full group and to give you an opportunity to share your thoughts and your voice. Real time, we'll be conducting polls and generating data in the room. So if you can just go to wherever you purchase apps for your tablet or smartphone and download Poll Everywhere. You see the icon that looks like the red one up there? Just download that to your smartphone. As you go in, it will ask you, are you presenting or participating? If you can just select the I'm participating, and it will take you to a page. It will have the polleverywhere.com / and then you just need to enter Water Week, and we'll be conducting the first poll over lunch. And so in a minute, we're just going to switch to the slides so you can see the data we're going to be generating over lunch. So I'll just switch to that in a minute, and then we'll come back.